That's it.
Sue Moroney.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I think anyone listening to this debate must be appalled that a Speaker from the government, there to promote her government's own budget, couldn't even get halfway through a 10-minute call before she resumed her seat. There is so little for her to say that is glowing about her own government's budget that she couldn't even get to the 2-minute bell before she sat down. And I think that probably just about says it all. But, Mr Speaker, the OECD had a lot more to say today about that government's poor performance with the economy, because the OECD report actually tells it like it is. It tells us that this is a government that actually doesn't have a brighter future at stake for New Zealanders. It tells us that this is a government that is deliberately putting in policies through its budget that actually grows inequality in this country, and that is not the path to a brighter future. But before I talk too much more about what the OECD had to say, I think that we can already see from what's happening in New Zealand that they have got it wrong. They have got it wrong. We don't have to be academics to know this. We don't have to read great long OECD reports to know this, because we can just pick up the newspaper or look on the internet and see that this very day we had 500 job losses announced from New Zealand Post. Now, 130 of those jobs were from my city of Hamilton. 130 jobs going today in Hamilton alone. Now, that not only has severe implications for those 130 workers and their families, so we're talking probably 400 or 500 people who are going to be directly affected by that announcement in Hamilton alone today, but that also has significant impact on the local Hamilton economy, because when those reasonably well-paid, decent jobs go, the wages of those jobs go from our economy as well, because those 130 workers will no longer have the wages to spend locally. Those wages will disappear from our economy, and the very next thing that will happen is that other small businesses will have to make further redundancies, Mr Speaker, in their companies, because the economy is in a downward spiral. And that's the impact of the lack of a plan from that government. Mr Speaker, the last Speaker for the government made much of the fact that they would be reaching surplus in 2014 or 15. And we agree with that in Labour. We think that's an important goal. But I think when they actually gave that commitment to New Zealanders at the last election, most New Zealanders expected that that government would reach that goal by growing the economy, that that's the way that the government would get to surplus by 2014. Well, Mr Speaker, not so, and the budget documents expose it. They are not going to reach surplus by growing the economy and improving economic growth in New Zealand. The way that they are getting to surplus is by actually keeping ACC levies higher than they need to be. So what they've done is they've reached into the pocket of every worker in New Zealand and every employer in New Zealand and kept their ACC levy, some call it a tax, kept that tax higher than ACC wanted it to be. Now, the other day in Select Committee, we found out how much they are taking out of workers' pockets. $400 million at least is being taken out of workers' pockets through ACC levies in order to create the illusion of a budget surplus for that government in 2014-15. $150 million is being taken out of the pockets of employers in this country for exactly the same purpose. If that government understood how to grow the economy, they wouldn't have to do that. They wouldn't have to resort to keeping a higher tax than necessary on ACC. And if that government understood what drives economic growth, they would much prefer to see that $500 to $600 million this year back in the pockets of workers and businesses so that they could spend that money in the economy and actually get the economy moving. But no. This government chooses instead to take that out of their pockets, put it in the government's accounts to create the illusion of a surplus. Mr Speaker, one of the main things that the OECD report said today was that the government's policy settings are growing inequality in New Zealand. And I want to talk about inequality because this week a very important case has gone before the Employment Court. And I want to congratulate both the Service and Food Workers Union and a very courageous woman by the name of Christine Bartlett for her standing up for New Zealand women. She's taken a case to the court around equal pay. She's asking the court to rule on whether it's okay for her to be paid $14.32 an hour as a caregiver in a rest home with 20 years' service. And that's a sort of inequality. She's been working for 20 years as a caregiver in a rest home, and she's on a little bit above the minimum wage. And she's going to court to say, is that fair? Well, that woman, on her $14.32 an hour, has much more courage than the Minister of Women's Affairs, who is the person who has paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to stand up for New Zealand women. Where is she on this issue? Well, what Joe Goodhue, the Minister of Women's Affairs, has to say to Christine Bartlett, she says to Christine Bartlett, if you want decent pay, go and do a man's job. If you want a decent rate of pay, Christine Bartlett, according to the Minister of Women's Affairs, go and train to be an electrician, go and train to be a plumber, but don't do that very important work of caring for people in rest homes. Well, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House and from Labor, I was there to congratulate Christine on her courage, because I know the courage and commitment that it takes to actually be the person who stands up and says it's not good enough. It's not okay to have the gender pay gap that we have in this country, and it's not okay for someone to have worked for 20 years in a field that actually requires a lot of intellectual capability. It's a very physical job and it's a very emotional job. It's a very, very skilled job, and here she is on $14.32 an hour.
Sorry to interrupt the member. The time has come for the dinner break. I shall resume the chair at 7:30 p.m.